So, good morning, Aaron.
Good morning. Welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so I'm here in Tel Aviv. It's a beautiful beginning of summer afternoon, extremely hot. And where are you calling in from?
We're on vacation actually in Bend, Oregon for a week. So it's hot here. I don't know if it's probably not as hot there, but it's hot for me.
Yeah,
High.
it's in like the high 80s, low 90s. I think it's beginning to cool off.
Okay. Yeah. So we hit the 90s for sure yesterday.
Oh, so you're probably not much better than us. Okay. Yeah, so my name is Danny Lieberman. I'm the host of Life Sciences Today podcast. We're hosting companies like Unlearn who do interesting and advanced and AI stuff for life sciences, mostly pre-market. We do a little bit of commercial post-market. Um, we're really interested in what people do, how they do it, and how it helps customers. So we'll start with you, Aaron. Tell me about your personal journey to Unlearn and what's going on.
Sure. Yeah, I had a circuitous journey for sure. I started a career as a mathematician, so went through academic track, did my PhD at University of Pennsylvania, uh, in geometry, topology, uh, postdoc, a couple years at University of Waterloo, um, and then decided I wanted to get into more applied work and not be working on such specialized in such a specialized space where only a couple people in the world know what you're talking about. Um, and so I made my way out to the West Coast to work for a startup. It's a pretty common story. This one was a fantastic experience overall. I was there for quite a while, actually 4 years, from 2013 to 2017, at a company called Leap Motion, um, which you could probably describe as a virtual reality company. Um, Increasingly during the time I was there, computer vision got taken over by machine learning. And so increasingly, I got really interested in machine learning and AI, and ended up working with a bunch of really interesting, smart, talented people there. And towards the end, ended up leaving and at the same time as two other guys who I was working with. And we founded Unlearn shortly thereafter. So that was in 2017. Um, and they had a similar background in many respects. They were both physicists. Um, and one of them was a particle physicist, and the other was a uh, biophysicist who actually had already worked as a computational scientist in pharma, so at Pfizer, and had a lot of interest in developing ML R&D in a direction where we could apply it to some problems in the biopharma space. So that was Charles, and he was certainly responsible for moving the three of us towards healthcare life sciences from a background that wouldn't have taken us there initially.
Right. So I know that Charles was the original. I think I'd been in touch with him a few years ago, so
Hmm.
so I remember that name.
Yeah, yeah. And so,
So you took that
yeah, go
path. What
ahead.
happened next?
So at that point we were working. So Charles had a lot of interest in um, Gen AI. I mean, it's interesting today. A lot of people are very excited about generative AI. They might be surprised to know that in 2017, generative AI was a big thing. It was like it was a big, exciting development in machine learning. Um, but it was primarily about image processing at the time. It was about generating images. There were things like GANs going on. We were interested in the problems related to building generative models of different types of data fundamentally that applied more in biopharma. So working with clinical trial data or genomic data, omics. So we were developing techniques that were centered around physics-inspired machine learning, but primarily for building generative models of clinical records, EHR records, and genomics data. And then trying to find applications in solving some key problems in the biopharma space. So that was kind of the early vision, but that was not a business plan at all. I mean, that was just that was kind of a research area um, overall. And so we managed to get some small chunk of VC money to kind of work on that research for a while, actually, like at least a year, um, before we started to hone what we were doing, how we were trying to apply things, and what some of the application areas were, and which ones we were not going to be working on. So uh, eventually we started developing the idea of building what we call digital twin generators, so generative models of clinical trial, longitudinal clinical trial records. Um, and the idea there being one of those models you can condition on any subject, any patient in a clinical trial. So conditioning meaning, in today's parlance, prompt on their baseline measurements. And that model would generate likely progressions for that individual, a whole distribution of progressions of that individual across all the clinical variables that are measured in that disease area, under the assumption in this case that they are under standard of care. So the reason being we're building models from control arms of clinical trials in that case. So you could so you could generate for any patient in a clinical trial, you could generate a digital twin, which is which provides you that kind of rich, comprehensive longitudinal predictions of their likely outcomes. And then you could apply that in various ways in the clinical trial space and clinical development to either make trials more efficient in various ways, and we can get into details, or apply it to trial simulation, trial planning, subgroup discovery. Um, Basically, these models are good at what they do for you fundamentally is provide you answers to counterfactual questions about that individual. How would someone likely progress if they're under standard of care in various ways? And because the models are rich and comprehensive, you can answer a lot of different questions of that ilk. And so there's ways of using them in different ways. But that was the key um, vision that we honed in on, as opposed to initially working more with EHR data or doing modeling of say, genomics or things like that.
That's really interesting. So where were you getting the data to train the models?
Yeah, so that is also a piece of the origin story in a sense, because the reason that we've had such a footprint in neuroscience and neurodegenerative diseases is because of the availability of data, clinical trial data in that space. So uh, there's various different kinds of clinical data that you can get your hands on in this space. Um, there's an inordinate amount of things like EHR data, um, which are, if you want to say broadly speaking, not as scientifically useful off the bat as something clean, let's say cleaner, or you know uh, unconfounded as clinical trial data. And so it
You're being very, very politically correct. You know that.
Well, I don't, yeah, so I'm not of the opinion that, say, real world data is shit or anything like that. But it has a lot of difficulties that make it harder to use it in the ways that you'd like. Um, and so,
So you'd want to, right? So I just to put a little
yeah,
context for our listeners here. I had a call this morning with a person who I will not mention their name from a pharma who I will not mention their name, but they are in the top 10. Okay. And so we're just talking about stuff and, things. And then at the end, I said something about, real world data and, cleaning data being a totally unsexy, low tech job that no one wants to do. And she said, God, she says, EHR data is so full of shit.
well, yeah, I guess I didn't say that. I said I won't say real world data shit, but
No,
Yeah,
no, no.
it's
I'd say you're being
yeah,
very diplomatic, but
yeah,
this
yeah.
person I was talking from this big pharma company, she was actually she said, and she gave me a few examples and said this is just totally improbable things. You know, physicians just anything, just whatever the whatever. You know, why were they putting this in? Why? Because they just randomly hitting a
Right.
key or something.
Right. Well, I think there's potentially some value that can be mined there. But maybe what you need is a paradigm where you think of it as like a refining process, and maybe you could think of real world data as the crudest of oil, or crud that you pull out of the ground, and you need actually potentially a ton of technology, uh, especially maybe new techniques that been made possible by the LLM revolution recently, um, along with an enormous amount of it. Because actually, some of those processes probably simply rely on inferences that can be made only from enormous amounts of data, given an enormous amount of noise to the signal, essentially.
Right,
Um, and
right.
there's also unstructured components, so there's doctor's notes and things, which I think is probably less well understood. But I do agree that if you want to take a sort of first order approach, you could say real world data shit and stuff from there, but
But
there's actually some interesting stuff to do, I think.
it's an interesting challenge,
Yeah.
and but so at this point you were getting data from I guess clinical trials and from EHR. Is that correct?
Registry. Well, so we did some initial work modeling EHR data actually. But I would say broadly speaking, that was in the space of just building these generative models of tabular time series data. Um,
Hmm.
and we, we kind of did some early sort of product slash technology discovery by doing some consulting projects with pharma. And so a few of these, I think we got our hands on some open EHR data. This is very early actually, where we did some modeling, but we shortly thereafter got our hands on some control arm data from clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease, um, and found that to be very productive. We suddenly realized that we could do something pretty interesting there.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah,
So that was sort of like a turning point for you then.
yeah, yeah. And initially, yeah, so I'm giving a very machine learning focused perspective, by the way, but that is sort of the
I,
origin
I
for
love it.
sure.
I love it because
Do not have
the
any.
perspective, the ML perspective is perfect for this discussion.
Yeah, we weren't a company that was founded by, say, an industry insider who's like a business person. So that's a strength and a weakness, actually, in our history. But um, so so initially we were excited about the full capabilities of generative AI in the space and the obvious thing to do with, let's say, a comprehensive model, generative model like this for standard of care in, say, Alzheimer's disease, is to imagine generating synthetic controls for single arm trials. Um, and of course, there's a vision that you could replace all trials with synthetic controls in an ideal universe if you had it like essentially a perfect model. Um, that's a long-term vision. But that vision actually powered, what we were working on early on, for sure. Um,
That's a great vision, but I have to, ask you, can you build a perfect model without understanding the human biology?
I mean, strictly speaking, probably no. There are, if you think of the human body as a complex system, and you know everything we know about like uh, complex systems that are unpredictable. There's things like chaos theory describing how small changes in initial conditions can cause massive changes in short periods of time later. Um, then technically no, you can't. And so you need to be careful about the way you apply such a model, what you're trying to do with it, because basically the context of use determines what you can and can't do. Um, but yeah, I think if you don't have a perfect mechanistic model, you have some error basically, and you have to figure out what you want to do with that error. If you can quantify it, which is an uh, if you do feel confident that you can quantify the error, you can at least control the error, then you could use it in certain applications in which uh, you can think about what the implications of a certain amount of error are, but not more than a certain amount.
I
But
understand.
like perfect precision medicine, for example, because even a clinical trial is an aggregate analysis. Even if I create a synthetic control, for example, with a digital twin model, typically what's happening is I'm still estimating an average treatment effect. But you can go even further and say maybe this model is suitable for precision medicine, in which case it's like for n equals one, for one individual, you're trusting its predictions with, decisions about how to treat that individual. That's an even higher level of trust in the accuracy of the model, actually. Um, and so I think we became a little more sophisticated over time to understand some of these limitations. Uh, and so one of the things that we developed, this is still part of the thread, actually, it's probably the next step in the thread of our history, so you got to it pretty nicely. Um, was realizing that at least in CNS, where we're building models primarily in CNS, um, there's just, I mean, there's not a lot of single arm trials. It's certainly not a large market, and it's not a space where you're commonly seeing uh, allowances for running large single arm trials. Like, there's no such thing as a pivotal single arm trial, or there's very rarely things like accelerated approval in that space relative to some other areas. Um, we realized that we could address the randomized control world, the randomized control trial uh, application in a powerful way with these models, which is by virtue of incorporating model predictions into the analysis of a randomized control trial, but without the concept of replacing any patients in the trial. It's more like for every patient in the trial, you're adding, by virtue of this model, you're adding some richness to each patient's measurements. You're adding some extra measurements that come that are kind of a summarization of what the digital twin model says for that individual to each measurement, and then incorporating that into the statistical analysis.
That's very interesting. And you mentioned before counterfactuals. So can you give me an example of how a counterfactual would help enrich a randomized controlled trial in that way?
Yeah, so the particular method or the sort of flagship method we developed maybe back in 2021, something like this, which is called prognostic covariate adjustment or PROCOVA. Um, it just leverages the framework of covariate adjustment, which is a well understood way of doing a statistical analysis in a clinical trial where you do a linear adjustment for some baseline covariate that you think is prognostic. So if, for example, you have a disease where uh, if someone perhaps is older, they tend to progress faster, then, for example, it would make sense for you to adjust for age in the analysis because the sum of the variation in the outcome is actually is determined by age. And so if you essentially factor that out, you get more signal on your treatment effect estimate. Um,
Hmm.
so what we realized is that you could apply the same framework where you summarize the output of a digital twin model for each individual in that trial into one or more prognostic covariates, so we call prognostic covariates. So instead of something that is measured at baseline, you have a machine learned function of everything that's measured at baseline to determine some particular feature that you're going to adjust for, which more comprehensively explains the variance in the outcome. And so really the best thing you can possibly have is a prediction of the outcome. Uh, that's like a mathematical fact. If there's no other error essentially if your trial data set is is unconfounded, then you have uh, the statement that the best thing you can adjust for is a prediction of the outcome. And so that's what the key idea behind prognostic covariate adjustment is. So in this case, for each patient in a randomized control trial, you take their baseline measurements, you generate the digital twin for that individual, and then you can condense that into a prediction of the outcome in that trial, whatever that outcome is. If it's like change from baseline in some composite score, then you're actually collecting the composite scores for that individual that are predicted by the model, and
And you're
then computing the predicted outcome. And then that becomes just like a baseline measurement in the trial. And so it has all of the statistical properties that um, make it satisfy regulatory guidances for just all phase 3 trials. So control of type 1 error is critical. No matter what the model outputs, you have control of type 1 error. So that means that uh, well, that's the primary issue that, a regulatory body like FDA or EMA or EMA cares about in the analysis of phase 3 trials. There are other issues too, but that's probably the number one thing.
got it.
Uh, yeah,
That's
so you essentially add your one way to think of it is this approach adds power to the trial without changing
requiring more patients.
yeah, without requiring more patients and without changing any other operating characteristics of the trial.
That's a very, very powerful approach. And with that, is that um, just something that occurred to me out of left field? Would that enable the sponsor to collect less dimensions, less parameters?
Um, Probably not less parameters. So in reality, the more parameters, the better in the sense that if those features are included in the model and if they're potentially prognostic, then you'd want to be measuring those. Um,
But I think this is not, I'm not sure I've ever seen any research that actually measured this because it's kind of a strange question. But in a second, I'll explain why that just occurred to me. Um, Most clinical trials, in my previous company, I was involved in over 70 clinical trials, and the tendency for sponsors is to collect much too much data. In other words, to collect
uh,
in other words, it's like saying, like, let's say you're doing a physical. I'm a physicist by training, right?
yeah,
You're measuring a state vector, which is like location, velocity, and acceleration, and maybe if you want to go further, jitter. Okay, so you're
right.
measuring, say, location, velocity, and acceleration, right? So it's like saying, let's do a clinical trial, and we'll measure location, velocity, and acceleration, and 2,500 more variables just in case we need them for FDA approval. Okay.
Uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
that's typically what sponsors do. And we would have this conversation with them at the beginning when they would send us the protocol. We would say at the beginning we would ask this question. After a while, we stopped asking the question, but because we knew the answer. So the but the best part about this is that um, one of our customers did a pivotal trial with 1,000 patients and like 100 sites. It was actually a successful trial. They got FDA. 6 months later, they called up um, and the team put the call through to me and they said, the CEO wants to talk to you. I said, how you doing? How's it going? How's the sales? He said, yeah, not bad. You don't remember the pivotal. And I said, do I remember the pivotal? Of course. And he said, for reimbursement, we really need quality of life data. I said, yeah, you collected that, didn't you? He said, yeah, but it wasn't required CRF. And do you think you could have your data science person retrieve the data and tell us how much we really have? So we did it. It took like a day or two to restore data sets, and write some SQL scripts and stuff. And we sent the data. Now I saw the data before I got it, and it was I felt bad for them. I felt sorry. I don't want to say sorry, but I felt kind of I felt bad. Okay, and because they were collecting a lot of data, and they had a connected drug. And that'll know a lot of data was being collected around the patient. So the patient data was perfect. Okay. Whatever was coming from the patient was fine. Okay. But I'm thinking to myself, it's like we're measuring the speed of a ball down an incline, like in a high school physics class, and that your physics teacher is telling you, by the way, I want you to measure the color of the leaves outside and how the students are feeling that day, and whether or not somebody might have a cold, and maybe how old the students are might be really important to know. And the gender of the students is really important also. And the ethnic makeup of the students is really important. Let's see what else. And by the end of this, it would be really nice to have. They have, like, 2,500 more variables in addition to the state vector. So this was a recurring theme that we saw in clinical trials. At the beginning, I was like, guys, that the best experiments in the history of science are simple, right? You know that, right? You know that a clinical trial is a scientific experiment. You know that. So why are you collecting 2,504 variables? And they said, well, we might need it. So here's the, sad story that, a few years ago, they needed quality of life and they forgot to make it a required CRF.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I agree with that. It sounds like to some extent it's an industry problem though, because you never know which downstream, well, you might not know which downstream, or at least there's downstream complexities that that seemingly require some of these measurements that otherwise are not involved in the clinical trial. And yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that from a modeling perspective, because we have worked on building models in particular diseases where we're combining data sets from 20, 30 sources, um, we can answer the question probably better than anybody, which features should be measured in order to maximize the power of your clinical trial using this kind of approach. Um, but we can't really say much about anything else. Um,
On the commercial side. So
Yeah,
let's
that's
yeah,
very interesting though. Yeah.
let's move on to the next question, which is, so you guys are doing a lot of really interesting things, and this clearly creates value. So I want you to talk to the value creation question. So first of all, who are your customers?
Yeah. So our customers are primarily sponsors, and we're primarily focused on efficacy trials. So we are working with sponsors who are running phase twos and threes. Um, we And so they're mostly pharma companies and a lot of times larger ones. Of course, they're biotechs running smaller trials. So we work with them, but probably our ideal customer profile is a large pharma. Um,
And
we
what's the value that you bring to the table? Why do large pharma work with you?
Yeah. So so I can talk a little bit about yeah, let me talk a little bit about this particularly this focus on adding power or reducing sample size in randomized control trials with Procova or versions of Procova. There's actually many versions of this kind of thing. Um, that's probably the number one value creation, although there's other things we do with our models that are uh, symbiotic in that space. Um, right. So the best way to think of it is if you're running a clinical trial, randomized trial, you can add power to your study without making any changes at all to the design of the trial. So what does that do for you? It increases the probability of success of that trial. Depending on where the actual treatment effect is, which no one can ever truly know, you can have a significantly more likely chance of detecting it if there is such an effect. Um, that is valuable. It's a little difficult to talk about how to price it exactly, but one way to think of it is that hypothetically, you're adding subjects to the trial, patients to the trial. So you're running a, say, phase two that you originally designed at, for your primary at like 70% power, um, maybe up to 80% power, let's say, without adding patients. So there's a value gain there in the sense that if you wanted to actually do that, you would have had to pay a lot more to run that trial, and it would have taken longer.
So is that the calculation that a pharma project manager will make?
So for power gain, I'll talk about the other side of the coin, which is sample size reduction in a second. But for power gain, that's the starting point for the discussion. I think, frankly, we haven't fully condensed a pricing model for power gain, in part because you're not necessarily pulling from a budget that was conceived ahead of time.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's part of the question. I think if this approach becomes more well used, which frankly, in our view, it should be used all the time. There's almost no good reason to not use an approach like Procova. Uh, it should be the standard in randomized control trials across the board. Um, and it somewhat baffles us that the industry is taking so long to move in this direction, but that's another, that's maybe for later in the discussion. But um, so yeah, that's the starting point. But I think it's worth considering the other side of the coin, which is sample size reduction. So if you add power to a design, you could essentially make two choices of how you want to use that. So one thing you could do is basically bank that power, and that's the power add application, which I was describing. You're increasing the probability of success of your trial. Another way you could do things is say, I'm going to spend that power. So, say I'm adding a certain amount of power to the trial, hypothetically, then what you can do is design the trial ahead of time, prospectively with fewer patients, so that you achieve the original design power with fewer patients.
And
And
less money and
yeah,
save. So if your
so
cost, so for the sake of argument, your cost per patient is say, assuming a complex trial would say a lot of lab tests, say $50,000 a patient,
right.
which is not unreasonable, and you saved, I don't know, you saved instead of 200, you did 100, so you just saved yourself $5 million, right?
Right, exactly. And so that is a little more straightforward, but it's worth mentioning the other sources of value in that direction. So not only do you save based on the cost per patient, so in a lot of applications, we're looking at, say, a 20% control arm reduction. That's a pretty like standard picture. Um, so you're reducing 20% for your control arm. You could reduce across the board, but usually people would want to reduce from the control arm because it's more it's better for recruitment actually if you have a smaller control relative to the treatment arm because people want to get a new therapy. Um, but because you have to recruit fewer patients, you can get through recruitment faster. You can get if the drug is successful, it will get to market faster. Um, and that actually, in a phase three, in a pivotal phase three, that is almost surely more valuable um, than actually just the cost savings of reducing the size of the trial. Um, and so that, of course, depends on a few things. You can't make that calculation across every area identically, but you there's a likelihood of success of a phase three trial, which a lot of phase three trials are essentially expected to succeed. So that's actually pretty high. But if you, it's not true in CNS, but it tends to be pretty high. If that drug makes it to market a certain amount faster, you're getting an enormous amount of income more quickly during the on-patent period of the asset. So
It's cash flow. It's
yeah.
cash coming to you faster than you might have done without your technology.
Hmm. Hmm. So, as far as pricing goes, we've typically signed deals that are oriented around the estimated cost gain or cost reduction of the patients removed from the trial. in the sample size reduction case. Uh, we typically haven't gotten into pricing around the downstream cash flow gains yet. I think we need more market adoption first before we start. Uh, I think making it more apparent that that gain is the real deal.
So it's kind of, so it sounds like it's kind of a project pricing model. So I come to you and say I'm a sponsor. And I come to you and say I'm doing a phase three I don't know CNS trial, which I'm very it's very important for me. And basically you say more power, smaller sample size. And presumably your salesman knows how to do the calculation and says, look how much money I can save you, but look at how much time I could save you. In other words, instead of going to FDA in 6 months, you'll go to FDA 6 months earlier.
Yep.
So uh,
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
6 months is cash flow, right?
Yeah, it's a lot. Actually, that number is one way we work with customers is there's kind of two ways we can work with customers, by the way. We have a bunch of models on the shelf that we can apply in these applications. But actually a pretty exciting area where some pharma companies, especially big pharma companies, want to have a franchise in an area. They have a lot of past trials in certain indications that are entirely proprietary to them. And one mode of interaction, or one mode by which we work with sponsors, is to forward deploy our entire tech stack in their infrastructure. And we have forward deployed engineers, and we build a custom model in that application on their historical data, along with any data that we source, um, that then we apply for power gain or sample size reduction in all of their subsequent trials in that indication. Um, and for example, one example of that recently where we start with a POC where we prove out the predictive accuracy of the model before applying it prospectively. The readout shows the readout that from that POC is that in future phase three trials in that indication, they'll get 6 months to market faster.
Oh, that
And
gives
that,
you that gives your sales team a very good basis
yeah,
for.
and that's their assessment. That's not like some marketing thing that we came up with. So that is a line. I gave a talk recently where I showed some specific numbers around this modeled on the lecanemab trial, where obviously we're known for working in CNS, so we have an AD model. We can essentially say what the lecanemab trial would have looked like if you used Procova for sample size reduction. That was obviously a large and very important phase three trial. We've worked with customers in AD who have quoted us, who run phase three trials in AD, who quoted us the cost per patient, which is eye-watering. It's over 300,000. Um, but so in that case, in that trial, there's 800 per arm, and you can reduce the control arm by about 270 patients. Um, uh, we even at 100,000 per patient, that's like 27 million. Um, and that's savings. And then, it's a blockbuster. So uh, the estimated time to market in that case for recruitment is reduced by about 4 months in that example. So that's an enormous amount of savings on the back end. Um, yeah.
So it sounds to me like you should be doing like kind of like a risk sharing model with the farmer. Um,
Yes, we are a startup though, and so we have we have finite runways, and it would it would be nice if we could, yeah, maximize our expected revenue indefinitely into the future. But I think we're not at that point right now. So yeah, risk sharing would be nice, but a lot of times we actually don't want to share a risk that pays off in like 8 years.
Yeah, I
Uh,
get it. Actually, I think the Oracle model is beautiful. So you just charge them charge them for the you said, forward deploy the system, charge them an enterprise license. Just use the old Oracle enterprise software model. Charge them an enterprise license, charge them 15% maintenance for forever. And guess what? The present value of that, 15 years down the line, it's just fine. Look at Larry Ellison. He's worth 25 times more than Mark, from Salesforce.com, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that no, there's something to that. And actually that's not just a sort of a business trick. I think
No, it's not. It's
a lot
it's
of people underestimate the uh technic or the infrastructural engineering aspect of these things. So we're building models that are combining data sources from many different sources. That means that there's an enormous amount of actually some of that nasty harmonization work that nobody wants to do, but is time consuming. It requires expertise and requires maintenance and basically the kind of high quality tooling that we've built internally. The fact that we can forward deploy that with customers is itself certainly a value add. And as a, you know, as a side benefit of some of these projects, like the one I described earlier, where we have a sponsor who's working in a indication, they're getting harmonized data that harmonizes nearly 20 clinical trials worth of data that they have internally, and they don't actually do that as far as we can tell.
don't. They don't.
Their clinical innovation teams just don't really have access to their data at that scale, so they can't run the kind of experiments that even they would want to do.
Yeah, so that's humongous. Actually, so are you charging an enterprise licensing model with maintenance?
Yeah, so we're developing a kind of master service agreement that is at the moment it's kind of menu based, but there's a maintenance fee and then there's these tech enabled services that are menu items that you can pull off of that. And we're developing that with a couple partners right now, and I think it'll become more standard. But I think we've given a
Customers,
lot of thought to like
customers, you mean?
customers, yeah.
Yeah, not partners. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, not partners, yeah, customers. We're developing a better understanding of what's possible in the space and what's not. I mean, there are certainly pure SaaS companies that sell software platforms in pharma, but that's not what we're talking about. Like, there's only like 150, I don't know, 100 total potential customers or something. You don't you don't have a typical SaaS model where you have 1 million customers and you're charging them $30 a month, and that's
No, 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 no. I don't know. It seems to me, it seems to me like we're going back to the time when the good old days, and Oracle still does that. They charge a lot of money for the product. The charging a lot of money for the product covers your costs. Then the maintenance fees covers all your upgrades and maintenance. And then whenever the customer has a bright idea, you say, okay, it's another X, and that covers your development costs again. So you have like a flywheel with the customer, and that's why Larry Ellison is worth 25 times more than Mark Benayoff. Okay, so think about that.
yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting point because I think SaaS kind of ruled Silicon Valley for a while. Although you hear now that well, I'm not knowledgeable on these things, but you do hear people say things now like SaaS is dead.
They're saying
Like
people are saying that
agentic
because
AI
they're
will kill
saying that
jobs.
because all kinds of influencers on LinkedIn are saying that, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's not because of what I'm telling. It's not because of our conversation. Your
Right.
conversation, listening to what you're saying, you're providing a product which is actually kind of a software slash data product slash customized system, and that's totally enterprise software. You sell. We sold. 1,000 years ago, we sold airline reservation systems. Okay,
Mm.
it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's a lot of money. And we charge, 15% per annum maintenance. And whenever the customer had a bright idea, we would charge them for the bright idea. And guess what? It kept the team of, maintainers going very nicely for a long time. And
Yeah,
the customer would come to us and say, hey, in addition to the the reservation system, it would be great if we could have crew scheduling. Okay. Okay. What does the salesman say in that case?
of course.
Of course, we have crew scheduling. And then the customer says, well, when can I have it? And then the salesman says with a straight face, he says, is next Monday okay for you?
Yeah, this is why people of my ilk that are working within companies like mine can have an aneurysm around the stuff that salespeople say. But
It's a
it's
true
part of
story. It's a true story. We actually did that. It wasn't actually next Monday, but we said something like the release will be coming out at the end of next month or something like that. And yeah, so we did it. But so that's actually a very exciting place to be, I think.
Mhm.
Not because people on social media are saying SaaS is dead or because AI or stuff like that, because you're doing something incredibly useful and valuable, and there's no reason for you not to get paid for it. So three things. Last question. This is kind of like Aaron, kind of like an interview question. It's like, they ask you in interviews, where do you want to be in 5 years, Danny? And you say, I'm not sure. But you say, in this case, I suspect you know the answer. So three things you want to do for your customers in the next 12 to 18 months.
Sure. So yeah, so one of them, yeah, one thing is so one critical milestone for us as a business, I would say, is kind of what I said earlier, that this approach of Procova really should be used all the time. The fact that it's not yet is a bit frustrating, and it's complicated, but I think a big part of it is just the extreme conservatism uh, of the industry. And I think, well, we have yet to have a public announcement of a phase three using sample size reduction. Um, we actually would have some, we actually signed such a deal a while ago, but in that case, the phase two read out negatively. So we had to, so that project actually got shut down. But I think getting a sponsor over the line with a phase three design in the next 12 months uh, would be uh, a huge milestone. Uh, Partly for us as a business, because I think it would be a inflection point because, as I said, the industry is a little conservative and mimetic. So once it's all uh, not finished the phase three, but just the protocol like approved and been through all the meetings with FDA. Um, that would be huge, and I think it would be a big feather in the cap for the first sponsor to achieve that as well. We help with the regulatory interactions. We've always had positive interactions with in those kind of meetings with FDA and EMA, so um, that is something we literally help with. But actually getting over that line with a sponsor in the next 12 months would be huge. We'd
That's the
be
first, that's the first thing.
yeah. Um,
Yeah, you have a budget of two more things there.
yeah. Another another is something I didn't mention at all, which is that we are finally moving fast into oncology. And I think oncology is really exciting and scary in a number of respects. Um, we did kind of avoid oncology for a long time for some number of reasons, but we've realized that we also, those are very theoretical reasons, and actually there's, I think, some very exciting problems that we can solve in that space and also bring the approaches I've talked about already, like Procova, to oncology. Um,
Too.
we Yeah, so getting into oncology, and I think particularly uh, doing a synthetic control in oncology, either for regulatory evidence or for commercial evidence, like for HTA bodies, would be a very exciting application that we'd like to be able to get over the line with a sponsor in oncology. So there's a ton of opportunities for synthetic controls um, in the context of these phase twos that are getting accelerated approval in oncology.
Okay,
Um,
for three.
and then number three, I think it's kind of in the same vein, but oncology also represents a opportunity for us to radically improve or change or modify the way we build models from a technological perspective. So you can think of oncology as a collection of rare diseases, which is the original reason we were not as excited about that area. But actually, I think with some of the more recent developments in AI um, architectures, I think there's some exciting ways that we could build models of with similar kinds of capabilities before, but would apply really well in the oncology space. And so these kind of models would be a little different than our historical ones, which tend to apply to a particular indication, because oncology has this complicated hierarchy of sub-indications, and it's like a taxonomy. You have to develop capabilities that apply to many sub-indications at the same time. And I think we'd like to bring validation to the market, even if I don't talk immediately about application. I think we'd like to bring some scientific validation of an approach to building digital twin generators in at least one large oncology sub area that we can demonstrate can apply uh, high quality predictive performance in many sub areas simultaneously.
That's really exciting. It's actually very, very interesting because it kind of resonates with something I'm hearing from other guests on the podcast, which is like this platform approach. And we heard this from a person who is doing amazing, very interesting work in rare genetic diseases of the eye.
Hmm.
And when we asked the question, how can you make money from that? He said, well, first of all, look at, I said, wait a minute, take that back. I know people make good money from rare diseases. Okay. So he said, well, what we're doing is like a platform approach. And kind of what it seems you're saying is like you're going towards that direction, which is really, really exciting. Uh,
You need to have efficiencies. You can't apply so much energy to some incredibly small rare sub area. On top of the fact that you'll have very little data, like say past patient level data that applies to that indication.
yeah, yeah. So it's like really super interesting area that you're in. And my name is Danny Lieberman. I'm the host of Life Sciences Today, and I have the honor and privilege of speaking with Aaron Smith, who is founder and data scientist,
What is my title? I don't know. ML scientist.
male scientist. But he's a scientist, he's a mathematician, and he's a very, very deep thinker. And he has a lot of really good insights into the business and the value creation and value capture. And we'll be looking for exciting things in the next 12 to 18 months. Getting past the finish line on your first phase three, on getting into oncology and developing that platform approach. Um, we will publish in about in a couple of weeks. And look for Life Sciences Today on your favorite podcast channel on Spotify and YouTube and Apple and Google. It's been a pleasure, Aaron.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's not every day. I mean, you guys are like doing interesting things and amazing stuff.
Thank you so much. Yeah.